We're all living in crazy and uncertain times, and it seems like music and the creative arts in general are at the forefront of the unprecedented changes, which are, well, I actually made a list of a bunch of them and all the other crazy stuff that's happening, but it was getting kind of long, and I figured everybody already knows what all that crap is. And because of the polarization in our culture today, even mentioning some of that stuff would make some people think that I'm making a political video, which this is not. I am making this video for the people who have been asking me for advice and guidance about the future of music, as well as my 3 kids who are all talented artists of different types. All of them are being squeezed psychologically, financially, and creatively from a world that's starting to look just a little dystopian. And in case you didn't know, dystopia is the opposite of utopia, which comes from a book called Utopia, written by Sir Thomas More in 1516, which describes a place where everything's perfect and everybody's happy. So dystopia would be the opposite of that, where everybody is unhappy and everything is terrible. Dystopian has been used to describe North Korea, books like 1984, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451, A Handmaid's Tale, and movies like Blade Runner, Gattaca, and Soylent Green. I would describe it as a world that is controlled by a small group of very rich and powerful people who see the rest of us as disposable. It's a world where people can't see a future for themselves, and they're just full of hopelessness. But as I sat down to write out my thoughts, I wondered, am I really qualified to even give any answers, because so many have been through so much worse and persevered. So I looked at the lives of artists from the past who'd had it harder than me and continued to make music. And I found it very inspiring, and I thought maybe it would inspire you too. But I need to warn you, the 3 stories I'm about to tell are a little disturbing. Gideon Klein was a Czechoslovakian pianist, classical musical composer, and educator who had to stop his university studies when Nazis invaded his country in World War II. Because he was Jewish, his music was banned and he could not perform publicly, so he had to use a fake name and identity. Despite these terrible circumstances, he continued to compose and was offered a scholarship at the Royal Academy of Music in London, England. But because he was Jewish, he wasn't allowed to leave the country, and he was sent to the Theresienstadt Ghetto, which was a Nazi concentration camp where they kept Jews and other undesirables till they were deported to work and death camps. This camp held an average of 40,000 people, and the death rate was so high that dead bodies were often left unburied for days, and gravediggers carrying coffins down the street were an everyday sight. There were other musicians and composers incarcerated there at the same time, including Victor Ullmann, Hans Klasia, Kadel Anchero, Raphael Schichter, and Pavel Haas. Klein helped to organize the cultural life amongst the prisoners so that artists could continue to create secretly and musicians and composers could rehearse and write, which they did in the basement of the men's barracks, using an old, broken-down piano. All of them wrote a significant amount of music and did a lot of performances while they were there. At first, they did this in secret, but eventually the Nazis found out. Instead of stopping them, they allowed them to continue so that they could photograph and film the performances and use that as propaganda. This is footage from when the Red Cross visited the camp and the Nazis filmed it and put it out, I guess so they could say, oh, they're not being treated so badly. But look at their faces. I mean, these people had to have known that they probably weren't getting out of there alive. How would you continue to create art and music under these circumstances? And then I found this quote by Victor Ullmann, who was one of the composers at the camp and was later sent to Auschwitz, where he died in the gas chambers. Most of the prisoners who were in Theresienstadt were killed, including Gideon Klein. But he's not been forgotten. Much of his music was smuggled out and is still performed today. In Russia, during the Soviet era, which was certainly a dystopian society, music and all the arts were censored, and many artists were punished, jailed, sent to the Gulag, or even murdered. One of the few who survived and managed to make it through the worst of the Soviet Union was Dmitri Shostakovich, who was a prominent Russian composer during this time. The Soviet government had denounced and blacklisted him and his music due to it being unpatriotic and its departure from the doctrine of socialist realism, which mandated that art should promote communist ideals. Somehow, these authoritarian numbskulls would interpret his symphonies in the most bizarre ways, but what could he do? Joseph Stalin, who was one of the most brutal dictators in history, was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time. But Shostakovich did return to favor with his Fifth Symphony, which the government had approved and allowed to be performed, and the response was overwhelmingly enthusiastic. The government leaders felt that this was heroic music, and it also showed that they could make artists bow to their demands. But the public saw it as an emotional reflection of the suffering that Russian people were going through. There were musical references to past pieces of music and operas that many viewed as a subversive condemnation of the government. And being that authoritarian governments tend to not be aware of or care how the average citizen feels, they were kind of clueless, so they saw it as a win and sort of an apology symphony. But years later, Shostakovich, along with a lot of other composers, were once again punished, denounced, and had all of their works banned because the leaders now insisted that they only write proletarian music. So he went from being the most prominent Russian composer to a very questionable future in trying to survive. But eventually, Stalin died, and restrictions eased up on artists, and Shostakovich was once again able to return to the public stage. He also joined the Communist Party and was part of official government agencies dealing with music. Some viewed this as a betrayal, while others viewed it as being sensible. But either way, it put him in difficult and sometimes humiliating positions because the government would send him out to international conferences to be the mouthpiece for the government, which had treated him like and he couldn't say what he wanted to say. He had to read their prepared speeches. One time, speaking at the Cultural and Scientific Congress for World Peace in New York City in 1949, he was so worked up about having to do that, he couldn't finish the speech, and someone else had to finish it for him. Nicholas Nabokov, a prominent writer at the time who admired Shostakovich, studied and met him, witnessed this. Later he wrote, "To me, he seemed like a trapped man, whose only wish was to be left alone to the peace of his own art, and to the tragic destiny to which he, like most of his countrymen, has been forced to resign himself." I don't know if I could have done that, but then I've never been threatened with arrest because of the music that I made. However, I did spend years working on major label record projects, and I always felt like some sort of spy because of the subversive things I would have to do to uphold any kind of musical integrity in what I considered to be an oppressive system. But that certainly pales in comparison to what Shostakovich went through. His life was in a vice grip of fear and pressure. Yet the beauty of his music made it through and is still renowned today. The Fifth is one of his most played symphonies. My dad used to talk about seeing Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald perform together in 1955 at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, where he was from. That would have been amazing to see. At the time, both Armstrong and Fitzgerald were international superstars, but what most people didn't know or didn't want to acknowledge is that both of them were risking their safety, if not their lives, by doing that show. Racism in America was at a level that was hard to comprehend, at least for a white person. Now, before I move on, I want to say this to any white people who are going to get their panties in a wad about what I'm about to say. I am not attacking you or white people. I'm just discussing historical facts. And no one can really know what another person of another race or culture or social class is going through or feels or what their life is like, so just chill out. Back in 1939, jazz singer Billie Holiday released a song called Strange Fruit, which was about the lynchings that were happening in America, mostly in the southern states. Lynchings could happen for any reason. A black guy said something to a white woman, someone starts a rumor or makes a wild accusation against a black person. There were no real trials or defense of the accused. They were just hauled out and strung up, often in town squares and public places in front of big crowds, like some kind of entertainment. The lyrics, written by Abel Meeropol under the pseudonym Louis Allen, are quite chilling. what's really disturbing is not only the fact that these lynchings were happening around America and being written in newspapers with pictures of people proudly posing in front of dead bodies, but the fact that this song ended up becoming a huge hit, which the dichotomy between these two things is kind of dystopian in itself. There were also these things called sundown towns, again, mostly in the South, where if you were black, and I'm not just talking about African Americans, I mean any non-white people, they were not allowed within the city limits after dark. So if you were black and you were caught in one of those towns, you were gonna get arrested or something way worse. So black people and famous black musicians either didn't travel at night or had to weave their way around these towns to get where they were going. Artists like Miles Davis, Charles Mingus, Little Richard, Max Roach, The Supremes, The Temptations, Sam Cooke, Sammy Davis Jr., Lena Horne, and so many more of these nationally recognized superstars often had to eat and sleep on the tour bus because there were few restaurants they could eat in, hotels they were allowed to stay in, they couldn't use restrooms in small towns, and weren't going to stop anywhere they didn't have to because the risk of being harassed, arrested, beat up, or who knows what was just too great. And when they finally did get to the venues where they were going to be performing, they were often not allowed to enter through the front door, use the same dressing rooms and bathrooms as the white artists. They weren't allowed to interact with the white audience off stage. And for some of those who were headlining Las Vegas casinos, they weren't allowed to walk freely around the place. In some places, interracial bands were illegal, and you certainly wouldn't have blacks and whites on stage together. And of course, they're exploited by the music industry, which has always exploited everybody, but it was way worse for them. Many of them never got paid for the records they were on, they had their songs stolen, and basically had their whole sound stolen. I mean, where do you think rock and roll came from? And some of country music comes from the music of black slaves. I mean, there's lots of books written about this. I just don't have the time to get into all of that right here. But even with all the crap that black artists have gone through, they still got on stage and performed everywhere from small town theaters to Carnegie Hall to Madison Square Garden for a nation that loved their music but held them down and oppressed them. Yet, they changed music. Were these people living in a dystopian world? No. But their lives were stuck in a reality that shared many characteristics of a dystopian world without much hope of it ever changing. And yet, they didn't stop making music. I was about to finish this video, and then I found this. This is a young artist from the Ukraine, Starchevsky, and he was doing a live stream, and then Russian missiles started hitting near his home. But watch this. Wow. I've been watching his videos, and he's in a desperate situation, but then I caught this in another one of his videos. What else can you say? So, how do we stay creative and keep making music in this crazy and dystopian world? Well, I'm not going to bullshit you. I don't have a magic answer. But I can tell you what I've always done because even in the best of times, music was a perilous proposition. I've worked on big records, I have this big discography, but to tell you the truth, there have been way more failures than successes. It's really hard to make a living in music. But even if you're not doing it for a living and you're just doing it because you love it, you'll end up with people around you asking things like, why do you do this? When are you going to grow up? What is this pipe dream? Why do you spend so much money on all these instruments and all this gear? Why? Why? Well, to me, the answer is pretty simple. I love music. It's all I've ever wanted to do. It's what I am, and I decided that that's what I'm going to do no matter what happens. Plus, these kind of stories and what's going on in the world today just pisses me off, which motivates me to not let the negativity and hate and these power-hungry fools run me over and change me. When I was a kid, I asked my mom, why did you have children? And she said, to make the world a better place. And I thought that was such a corny thing to say, but over the years, I've had people come back around and tell me that I changed their lives in very positive ways, even though I didn't realize that that's what I was doing. I believe that we make the world that we live in, and I believe that humanity is slowly moving towards a better place despite the temporary insanity it's going through right now, because if it weren't, we'd still be living very short lives in caves. So even if I never get to see that better place, if I can, in some small way, make the world a better place, doing what I love, then that's what I'm going to do.